Most people don't fail the CIPP/exam because it's difficult. They fail because they fall into a few very predictable traps. In fact, I've seen experienced professionals, people who understand GDPR, still get these questions wrong simply because they miss small but critical distinctions. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the most common CP/exam traps, the exact areas where candidates get confused, and how you can avoid them. If you get these right, you're already ahead of most test takers. Today we're tackling the number one confusion that trips up exam candidates: consent versus legitimate interests. This single distinction accounts for 15% of exam failures, but in the next 5 minutes, you'll master it completely. Here's where students go wrong. They believe 3 dangerous myths. Myth number 1, consent is always the safest choice. Wrong. Myth number 2, legitimate interests means you can do whatever you want. Also wrong. And myth number 3, they're basically the same thing. Completely wrong. If you believe any of these myths, you're setting yourself up to fail 2 or 3 questions per exam. Let's fix that right now. Let me show you exactly how this plays out on the exam. Here's a real question type you'll see. A company wants to send marketing emails to customers who purchased products last year. Which legal basis should they use? Most students immediately pick a Plinus consent, and that's exactly the trap. The question doesn't say they're getting consent. It asks which basis they should use. And here's the key. This is actually a legitimate interest question. Answer C. Let me show you why and how to never fall for this trap again. First, let's nail down consent. To remember what makes consent valid, use the acronym FREE. F, freely given. No coercion, no pressure, no power imbalance. This is why consent rarely works in employment situations. R, reversible. Withdrawing consent must be as easy as giving it. One click unsubscribe, not a phone call to customer service. E, explicit action require. A clear affirmative action. Pre-tick boxes, not valid consent. And the second E, each purpose must be separate. You can't bundle marketing consent with your terms of service. That's not freely given. Remember, FREE, 4 requirements, all mandatory. Miss 1, not valid consent. Now let's tackle legitimate interests. This one has a 3-part test. Remember, L and B. L, legitimate purpose. Your interest must be lawful, clearly articulated, and real, not speculative. Commercial interests are legitimate. This was confirmed by the Court of Justice in 2024. N, and here's where students mess up. Necessary means required, not just useful or convenient. Ask yourself, is there another way that's equally effective but less intrusive? If yes, then it's not necessary. B, balancing test. Even if you have a legitimate purpose and it's necessary, you still have to balance it against the data subject's rights and freedoms. Processing special category data, children's data, your balance probably fails. All 3 parts must pass. Fail 1, and you can't use legitimate interests. It's that simple. Here are the 3 critical differences that win you exam points. Distinction number 1, control. With consent, the data subject is in control. You're asking for permission. With legitimate interests, the controller is in control. You have a reason to process. Distinction number 2, what happens when they say stop? With consent, withdrawal means you must stop processing immediately, no questions asked. With legitimate interests, they can object under Article 21, but you can refuse if you have compelling legitimate grounds that override their interests. Distinction number 3, power imbalance. Consent is problematic when there is a power imbalance, like employer and employee, or a contract of adhesion where they have no real choice. But legitimate interests may actually work in these situations because you're not pretending they have a free choice. Think of it this way. Consent is asking permission. Legitimate interest is having a good reason. Here's your memory trick that will serve you throughout the exam. Consent equals asking permission. The data subject grants you access. Legitimate interest equals having a good reason. You justify the access. This single distinction will help you answer every consent versus legitimate interest question on your exam. Now we will be tackling controller versus processor, a distinction that causes cascading failures across multiple exam questions. Get this wrong and you'll miss questions about contracts, liability, DPOs, and more. Let's fix that right now. Here's why students fail. They make 3 wrong assumptions. First, They think whoever owns the data is the controller. Wrong. Second, they think big company equals controller, small vendor equals processor. Also wrong. Third, they think if you pay someone, they're automatically your processor. Wrong again. The real problem, students focus on who has the data instead of who makes the decisions about processing it. Here's how this trips you up on the exam. Company A hires Company B to analyze customer data and recommend marketing strategies. Who is the controller? Most students immediately say Company A, they hired the vendor, they own the customers. But look closer. Company B is deciding how to analyze the data and what strategies to recommend. Company B is making independent decisions about means. That makes them a controller too. Specifically, joint controllers under Article 26. This is the trap. Here's the definitive test. Ask, do HO decides? Controllers determine why you're processing, the purposes, and how you're processing, the means. Processors process only on instructions. They make no independent decisions. They just execute what the controller decides. Think of it this way. Controller equals boss, makes all the decisions. Processor equals robot, just follows the orders it's given. If someone is making independent decisions about what to do with the data or how to process it, they're not a processor. Let's look at real examples. True processors. A payroll company that you tell exactly what to calculate, they just process the numbers you give them. Cloud storage, where you decide what files to store and they just store them. Email service, where you decide what messages to send and they just deliver them. Now, who are not processors? A marketing agency that decides strategies, they're making independent decisions, they're a controller. An analytics company that decides what insights to generate, controller. An AI service that determines how to process your data, likely a controller. See the difference? It's not about the service they provide, it's about who makes the decisions. Use these 3 questions to figure it out every time. First, who decided to collect this data? That's the controller. Second, who decided what to do with it? That's the controller. Third, who just execute instructions without making decisions? That's the processor. And here's the tricky part. If both organizations jointly decide the purposes and means, they're joint controllers under Article 26. This is common with things like social media plugins on websites. The website and the social platform jointly decide purposes. Why does this matter so much? Because if you get the controller versus processor distinction wrong, you'll cascade into failures across the entire exam. You'll miss questions about Article 28 processor contracts. You'll miss Article 26 joint controller arrangements. You'll get DPO requirements wrong because processors and controllers have different requirements. You'll mess up liability questions. Article 82 says both can be directly liable, and you'll confuse GDPR obligations because they have different responsibilities. This one distinction affects more than 20 exam questions. Watch for these red flags on the exam. Processor indicators, processes on behalf of, following instructions, mentions of Article 28 contracts, contracted to provide services. Controller indicators, determines purposes, decides how to process, sets parameters, makes independent decisions. Joint controller indicators, jointly decide, common purposes, or mentions Article 26 arrangements. These phrases are your clues. Watch out for these exam tricks. Trick 1. Size doesn't matter. A small vendor can be a controller if they make decisions. A large company can be a processor if they just follow instructions. Trick 2. Payment doesn't determine the role. You can pay a controller for their services. Free services can be processors. Trick 3. One company can have multiple roles. They might be a processor for email hosting, but a controller for their own analytics on aggregate data. Now we will be clarifying Article 13 versus Article 14, one of the most tested transparency requirements on the exam. Get the timing wrong, and you'll fail multiple questions about information obligations. Students think Article 13 and 14 are basically the same. Just give people a privacy notice and you're done. Wrong. They think these articles are interchangeable. Also wrong. They think both require exactly the same information. Wrong again. The truth is, these have completely different triggers, different timelines, and even slightly different information requirements. Here's the simple rule that solves everything. When you obtain the data determines which article applies. Article 13, direct collection. You collected the data from the data subject themselves, like a web form they filled out. Information must be provided at the time of collection. Article 14, indirect collection. You obtain the data not from the data subject, like you bought a list or got it from a partner. Information must be provided within 1 month of obtaining the data. Let's break down Article 13. This applies when data is collected from the data subject. Examples. Customer fills out a web form on your site. Employee provides information directly to HR. Patient gives their data to a doctor. Someone subscribes to your newsletter. The timing requirement is critical. At the time of collection, meaning before or at the moment when you obtain their data. The key phrase in Article 13 is at the time when personal data are obtained. That's your clue this article applies. Article 14 applies when data is obtained, not from the data subject. Examples. You purchased a marketing list. You got data from a business partner. You searched public records for information. You scraped social media profiles. You used a lead generation service. The timing is different here. You must provide information within 1 month of obtaining the data, Oregon, before your first communication with them, or before you disclose it to another recipient, whichever comes first. Notice the flexibility here that Article 13 doesn't have. Both articles require mostly the same information. Controller identity, purposes, legal basis, recipients, retention periods, data subject rights, complaint rights, and DPO contact. But Article 14 has 2 additional requirements that Article 13 doesn't. You must tell them the categories of personal data you have about them. Because they didn't give it to you directly, they don't know what you have. And you must tell them the source of the data. Where did you get it from? This makes sense because it's indirect collection memory trick. Direct equals at time. Article 13, direct collection, at the time of collection. Indirect equals in a month. Article 14, indirect collection, within 1 month. Plus, for indirect, you must tell them the source because they didn't give it to you directly. Watch for these exam red flags. Article 13 indicators collects data from customers, registration form, subscription, directly from data subject. Article 14 indicators obtained from third party, purchase list, business partner provided, publicly available sources. The key exam trick, focus on where the data came from, not what you're planning to do with it. The source determines which article applies. Moving on to one of the most fundamental questions in data protection, personal data versus anonymous data. This distinction determines whether GDPR applies at all. Get this wrong and you'll misunderstand the entire scope of the regulation. Let's make sure you never confuse these again. Here's why this matters so much. GDPR applies to personal data. It does not apply to anonymous data. That's a massive difference. One letter, the difference between anonymized and anonymous means completely different legal obligations. And here's where students go wrong. They think if you've anonymized data by removing names, you're done. Wrong. True anonymization is extremely difficult and has very specific requirements. Let's start with personal data. Article 4(1) defines it as any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person. The key word here is identifiable. It's not just about direct identification like names or ID numbers. It includes indirect identification, where you can combine data points to figure out who someone is. If it's reasonably likely that you could identify an individual, even indirectly, it's personal data and GDPR applies. Now, anonymous data, this is data that is not covered by GDPR according to Recital 26. But to be truly anonymous, the data must meet a very high bar. You cannot identify the individual. You cannot re-identify them with reasonable means. The anonymization must be irreversible. And here's the critical part. It must pass 3 tests. First, singling out an individual must be impossible. Second, linking records about an individual must be impossible. And third, inferring information about an individual must be impossible. All 3 must be impossible. If any one of these is possible, it's not anonymous, it's still personal data. Students constantly confuse pseudonymous data with anonymous data. Let's be crystal clear. Pseudonymous data, defined in Article 4(5), is still personal data. GDPR still applies. Pseudonymization is when you replace identifying fields with pseudonyms, like replacing names with ID numbers. But crucially, you can still re-identify people if you have the key or additional information. That makes it personal data. Anonymous data, on the other hand, is not personal data. GDPR does not apply. You cannot re-identify anyone, period. For example, replacing customer names with ID numbers, that's pseudonymization, still personal data. But aggregate statistics like 500 visitors with no way to identify anyone, that's anonymous data. Let's look at common examples. IP addresses. These are personal data according to Court of Justice case law. Cookie IDs minus personal data. Device identifiers personal data. Location data personal data. Browsing history personal data. Voice recordings personal data. Photos of people personal data. Notice a pattern? Most data organizations collect is personal data. Now what's actually anonymous? A total count like 500 visitors today, that's anonymous. Aggregate statistics like average age 35 minus anonymous. Properly anonymized datasets where re-identification is impossible, anonymous. But these are rare. Watch out for these exam tricks. First, hashed data. If it's reversible or you kept the key, it's still personal data. Second, aggregated data. Check carefully whether individuals can still be singled out. If the dataset is small, aggregation might not prevent identification. Third, publicly available data. Just because it's public doesn't mean it's not personal data. It absolutely still is. Fourth, we remove names. Removing one identifier is not enough for anonymization. You need to remove or alter all identifying elements. And fifth, watch out for small datasets. The smaller the dataset, the easier it is to re-identify people, which means it's still personal data. Now we will be diving into special category data exceptions, Article 9 of the GDPR. This is one of the most tested topics on the CIPP exam, and here's the problem. Students think consent is the only option. They memorize special category data needs consent, and they stop there. But Article 9.2 has 10 exceptions. 10, and knowing all of them can earn you multiple exam points. Let's master this right now. Here's the setup. Article 9.1 says processing special category data is prohibited. Full stop. But students make three huge mistakes. First, they think only consent works as an exception. Wrong. There are 9 other exceptions. Second, they think you can't process health data without consent. Wrong. Healthcare professionals process health data all the time under different exceptions. Third, they think special categories always need explicit consent. Wrong. Explicit consent is just one of 10 exceptions. The truth is, Article 9.2 provides 10 different ways to lawfully process special category data. You need to know all of them. First, let's be clear about what special category data actually is. Article 9.1 lists 8 types of sensitive data: racial or ethnic origin, political opinions, religious or philosophical beliefs, trade union membership, genetic data, biometric data when used for identification, health data, and data concerning sex life or sexual orientation. These are considered so sensitive that there's a blanket prohibition on processing them, unless you meet one of the 10 exceptions we're about to cover. Here are all 10 exceptions from Article 9.2. Exception A, explicit consent from the data subject. Exception B, employment, social security, and social protection law. Exception C, protecting vital interests when the person can't give consent. Exception D, legitimate activities of foundations, associations, or non-profit bodies. Exception E, data manifestly made public by the data subject themselves. Exception F, establishing, exercising, or defending legal claims. Exception G, substantial public interest based on EU or member state law. Exception H, health or social care purposes. Exception I, public health purposes. And exception J, archiving, research, and statistics purposes. 10 exceptions. The exam will test you on all of them, not just consent. Let's focus on the 3 most common exceptions you'll see on the exam. First, the employment exception, Article 9.2b. This covers HR departments processing health data about employees. Things like occupational medicine, sickness absence, fitness to work assessments. You don't need employee consent for these because they're necessary for employment law obligations. Second, the public interest exception, Article 9.2g. This requires a basis in member state law and must be proportionate. It's often used for government functions. And third, the healthcare exception, Article 92H. This allows medical diagnosis, healthcare provision, and management of health services. Healthcare professionals process patient data under this exception, not consent. Memorize these three. They appear constantly on the exam. Now here's something critical that students always miss: the double legal basis requirement. To process special category data, you need two legal bases, not one, two. First, you need an Article 9(2) exception, one of those 10 we just covered. That deals with the special category prohibition. But you also need a standard Article 6(1) legal basis, like consent, contract, legal obligation, or legitimate interests. Both are required. Let me give you an example. A hospital treating a patient. They use Article 92H for the healthcare provision exception, but they also need Article 6(1)(c) for the legal obligation to provide care. Both, always. This is a common exam trap. They'll give you the Article 9 exception and ask if processing is lawful, and the answer is no unless there is also an Article 6 basis. Watch for these red flags on the exam. Consent indicators. Look for phrases like patient agrees to research, explicit consent obtained, or voluntary participation. Employment exception indicators. HR processes sick leave, occupational health assessment, workplace medical, healthcare exception indicators, medical treatment, healthcare professional, patient diagnosis, public interest indicators, required by law, government function, statutory obligation. The exam will drop these hints to tell you which exception applies. Train yourself to spot them. Let's quickly recap the key takeaways from this section. First, don't assume consent is the default. For special category data, remember the key exceptions and the need for a double legal basis. Second, always identify roles correctly. Ask who decides to distinguish between controller and processor. Third, apply transparency rules carefully, especially when dealing with direct versus indirect data collection. And finally, don't confuse pseudonymization with anonymization. Pseudonymized data is still personal data under GDPR. If you keep these distinctions clear, you'll be much better equipped to handle tricky, scenario-based questions in the CPP/exam.